Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on the Initiating Process Group. The PMBOK guide goes through all of the different processes in the order of knowledge areas, knowledge area by knowledge area. Many courses follow this same pattern, mimicking or mirroring what the PMBOK guide does. However, one of the biggest struggles that people have when they're learning this material is figuring out what order to do these things in. And approaching this from a knowledge area perspective does not help you figure out the order. On the other hand, it's a lot easier to learn the order if you go process group by process group. So that's what these lessons do in this course. We start with the initiating process group. What are the things that we do when we start a project? Then we move on to the planning process group and all of the planning processes, and we'll cover them in a logical order. Then we move on to the executing, monitoring, and controlling processes, and we cover those as a set because when you're actually executing the project, your monitoring and controlling will be going on at the same time. And then finally, we cover the closing process. This lesson covers the processes, key points, inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of the initiating process group. This process group is about getting to know who's who, those who will be affected by the project, and those who may have an impact or interest in the project. In other words, the project stakeholders. It also covers or includes developing a high-level description or outline of the project, including what it will deliver, how much it will cost, and when it will be done. And finally, officially authorizing and kicking off the project is part of the initiating process group. As you can see here on the PMP process table from page 25 of the PMBOK guide, there are only two processes in the initiating process group. These are develop project charter and identify stakeholders. Develop project charter is at the top of the table in the integration management knowledge area. Identify stakeholders is at the bottom of the table in the stakeholder management knowledge area. None of the other knowledge areas have processes in the initiating process group. The interests of these other knowledge areas are covered by these two processes at this time, and later in more detail in the planning process group. In the planning process group, you can see that these other knowledge areas are quite well represented. But for the initiating process group, it's just these two: develop project charter and identify stakeholders. The develop project charter process has just two outputs: the project charter and the assumption log. The identify stakeholders process has a few potential outputs that are secondary, but only one primary output, and that is the stakeholder register. We'll cover the primary output first, and then come back to the secondary outputs. This is because the key to understanding and remembering the many project management processes in the PMBOK guide and in the project management standard is to focus on the primary outputs first. This will make it easier to remember the inputs, tools and techniques, and secondary outputs. Categorizing outputs as primary and secondary and focusing on the primary outputs first is not a concept that you'll find in the PMBOK guide. It's part of what makes this course stand out. It makes it easier for you to learn and remember this material, which will help you on your projects as well as on the PMP exam. How much do you remember of the definition of the project charter? What are the key elements of the definition? The project charter is a document issued by the project initiator or sponsor that formally authorizes the existence of a project and provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to project activities. Key points here are that it is issued by the sponsor, not the project manager, although the project manager can and probably should help. It formally authorizes the project and provides the project manager with the authority needed to get the project going and manage it. Do you remember which documents are created before the project charter? Remembering these documents that are developed before the project's initiating processes will help you to remember some of what goes into the project charter. These prior documents are the needs assessment, which identifies and analyzes the needs that first got people talking about doing a project. Then there's the business case, which includes the cost-benefit analysis and a recommendation for a project. And finally, there is the benefits management plan, which defines what success means for the project, how the project's benefits will be realized, measured, and sustained. Each of these provides valuable information for the development of the project charter. Remember that the business case is the culmination of this pre-initiating work and authorizes continued work on the project, just as the project charter authorizes moving on to the next step of project planning. How much do you remember about what is in the project charter? The project charter includes the project purpose, the measurable project objectives and related success criteria. Notice the keyword measurable. It isn't very useful to have objectives and success criteria that you can't effectively measure. Then we have high-level requirements and high-level project description, boundaries, and key deliverables. These deliverables will be described at a high level and elaborated on with more detail later. It should also include the overall project risk and, if possible, a summary milestone schedule, which will identify some of the key milestones that are driven either by external events or which are requested by your key stakeholders. If there are any pre-approved financial resources, those should be identified here. It's also important to have a list of your key stakeholders, your project approval requirements, and project exit criteria. It's good to get these defined early on. It will, of course, also list the assigned project manager, what their responsibility is, and what is their authority level. And it will also name and provide the authority of the sponsor. Some key points to remember about the Develop Project Charter process are that the project charter establishes a partnership between the requesting and performing organizations. The project charter is not a contract. A contract is something that involves consideration, usually payment in exchange for goods or services. You use a formal contract for external projects, but not for internal projects. However, if you have been hired to do a project for someone, then you can still use a project charter internally within your organization to help provide clarity and consistency in what is required and to help your team be more coordinated. It's also important to identify the project manager early as possible, preferably during the Develop Project Charter process, if not earlier. The project manager can be very helpful, and it can benefit the project manager if they're involved in the needs assessment, the business case, and the benefits management plan. However, No matter when the project manager is involved, it definitely needs to always be before the planning processes, which will develop the project management plan. Your project sponsor should be someone who is high enough up in the organization that they are able to commit the funding and other resources needed for the project. On the other hand, this sponsor shouldn't be so high up that they become unavailable to you. It's important to be able to escalate as needed to this project sponsor. The project charter is your key document for making sure you keep all of your stakeholders on the same page throughout the project. And as the priorities and objectives of the project can change slightly over the life of the project, it's important to keep the project charter up to date. That way, as people come and go on the project, they can be brought up to speed quickly on what the high-level goals of the project are. Knowing what you know about the project charter, its contents, where it comes from, and how it's used, can you guess what the inputs would be for the develop project charter process? They start with some business documents. PMBOK guide specifically lists the business case and the benefits management plan. Notice that the needs assessment is not included here. This could be in part because the needs assessment is summarized in the business case. However, if you need to take a closer look at the needs assessment, that could certainly be an input. Remember that these lists in the PMBOK guide are not all-inclusive lists. They're guidelines of things that are most commonly used as inputs, but not rules about what must or can't be on the list. Agreements is here because if you have any applicable agreements with partners or vendors, those need to be considered as you put together your project charter. Also, you have the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets, which I abbreviate as EEF and OPA. There are several of these, and we'll cover these in the next slides. Some of the enterprise environmental factors that are inputs to the develop project charter process include government or industry standards and legal and regulatory requirements. Examples of standards and regulations include standards specifically for the product, quality standards, safety standards, workmanship standards, equipment operating and maintenance standards, building codes, Department of Defense regulations, FCC regulations, OSHA, which stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration, applies to many different industries. MSHA, or Mine Safety and Health Administration, applies to the mining industry. You may also need to follow different regulations such as HIPAA for medical records, and consider PPI, or personally identifiable information, and keeping that information secure. Information security limits where data can reside and where work can be done. In some states, you cannot do any work on a project or use any data outside of that state if you're on a project for that state government. There are also standards and requirements and regulations regarding environmental impact, food safety, and even ADA Section 508 compliance, which is about making your software accessible for those with disabilities. So you can see there are quite a number of government and industry and other legal and regulatory requirements that you need to consider as inputs when you're putting together your project charter. You also have marketplace conditions, so you should consider the current and expected state of the economy, locally, nationally, and globally. And how does this affect your consumers? Who are your competitors? And what alternatives or substitutes are available to your consumers for the product or service that you're working on? Then there's the organizational culture and political climate. Who's who, and how do you get things done? What are the values and norms for communication within your organization? Is it a strict hierarchy or more of a flat organization? Do you have lots of upfront planning, or do you have an approach that's more of a fail-fast approach? Are there labor unions or professional associations, such as for doctors or lawyers, that are key stakeholders? Does your organization or your stakeholders expect that in this project you will put in overtime and have big pushes to get things done on time? Or does your organization work at more of a sustainable pace? What are your stakeholders' risk thresholds? What's their risk tolerance? Are they risk tolerant or risk averse? Have there been any recent incidents that have changed their risk tolerance? And then you have your organizational process assets to consider as inputs. What are your organization's policies, processes, procedures, and governance? What governance bodies do you have in your organization? How is information gathered and reported? Is it more formal and structured, or more informal or ad hoc? Do you have certain monitoring and reporting requirements? Are there templates that you can use? You may have some very helpful project charter templates that you can start with. And what historical information do you have in your lessons learned repository that can help you in putting together a complete project charter? The four main categories of tools and techniques for developing the project charter include expert judgment, data gathering, interpersonal and team skills, and meetings. Expert judgment is an important one to consider. Make sure that as you put together the project charter, that you consult as appropriate with experts both inside and outside your organization. Those that are experts in organizational strategy or benefits management, or who have deep technical knowledge of the industry or focus area of your project, that have expertise in estimating durations, costs, and budgets, and in identifying risks. The three main tools for data gathering that are listed include brainstorming, focus groups, and interviews. Brainstorming lets you quickly identify ideas, something that is done as a group with a facilitator, and those ideas are first generated and then analyzed. Focus groups are smaller groups of people, including stakeholders and subject matter experts, in which you have small group conversations about the project or its objectives or what success means, what the risks are, identify what the assumptions or constraints are, and so on. Interviews, on the other hand, are one-on-one meetings with people. You'll need conflict management skills because not all of your stakeholders are going to agree. You'll need effective facilitation skills in order to get the participation and mutual understanding that you need, and to consider everyone's input and guide them in their decision making in order to come up with some successful decisions and resolutions. And then, of course, you'll need to follow up on any action items and agreements. And then you have meeting management as a skill. Good meetings will have an agenda. All the right people will be there. You won't have people that don't need to be there. You'll take meeting minutes, action items, and then follow up on those action items. You may use other tools and techniques as well. Other techniques include nominal group technique, Delphi technique, surveys, questionnaires, and others. Remember that it's the project sponsor or initiator that approves the project charter, not the project manager, and that it's preferable but not required that the project manager participate in the writing of the project charter. The project charter is the key document that defines the overall project at a high level, guides the development and maintenance of the project management plan, and is, of course, an input to all of your project management plans. It's used to evaluate progress and alignment throughout the project lifecycle, and it's reviewed at the beginning of each phase of a project. Having focused first on the primary outputs and inputs of the developed project charter process, this diagram of inputs, tools and techniques and outputs shouldn't be nearly as intimidating anymore. This concludes part 1 of this lesson. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.